24. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking at the first conviction of a former head of state by an international court since the Second World War. Charles Taylor, former president of Liberia, convicted for his part in triggering a brutal civil war in neighboring Sierra Leone that lasted 1 decade. With us from The Hague in the Netherlands, Sierra Leone attorney Alpha Cisse of the Open Justice Initiative. Welcome back. Let's welcome back as well Alyx Vance of UK think tank Chatham House, and Jonathan Randall, who covered Liberia's civil war for the Washington Post. Just before the break, Alpha Cisse, you were talking about how this is far from over, only the beginning. In your heart, is Charles Taylor guilty?
Well, that is what the judges have said, and listening to the evidence, of course, it was very clear that Taylor had some responsibility for the conflict in Sierra Leone. Now, the level of that responsibility, in my mind, I really could not determine. Before the case actually started, I mean, I was like any other Sierra Leonean who always thought that Charles Taylor had all the responsibility for what had happened in Sierra Leone. I was one of those who thought that he had provided all the support to the rebels, and without him, the rebel war probably could not have started in Sierra Leone. When the proceedings started, I started following the evidence, at some point, like, I had a change of heart on certain issues, but I always had it in mind that Taylor bore some responsibility, and that is exactly what the judges said today.
And what kind of sentence do you think he deserves?
Well, I can't say with certainty. Now, the case came to trial on a note of very high expectations. For very many people, the evidence was always on the table. The paper trail was there, and so Taylor was just supposed to have been sentenced to life in jail. Now, we all thought at some point, all right, let's see what command responsibility will look like. Let's see what joint criminal enterprise will look like. Now the judges have said those ones were not proven, and it's just aiding and abetting. So we expect that probably the sentence will not be high as it will have been if the prosecution had got him on those 2 counts. But those 2 modes of liability, sorry. But take note also that in addition to aiding and abetting, the judges also said that Taylor was involved in the planning of attacks on Connor, McKinney, and Freetown in late 98 to early 99. Now, if you talk about the atrocities that were committed in Freetown, especially when rebel forces entered the capital in January 1999, they were massive. And so if the judges give consideration to all of those and having put responsibility on his shoulder that he helped plan that operation, then that might have some impact on sentencing as well. But we can't say with certainty whether it could be 10 years or 50 years. We'll just speculate. If anything, we'll have to wait and see.
All right. In 1997, just for reminders, Charles Taylor beat the now president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, soundly in a presidential election, garnering 3/4 of the vote. That ahead of that election, youths in the street of Monrovia chanted, "He killed my mother, he killed my father, I vote for him." I guess a glib way of coping. Liberians always have a sense of humor. It's a coping mechanism in a difficult situation. But there was an element of truth to that. There were a lot of people who genuinely liked Charles Taylor, and still do to this day. The Toronto Globe and Mails, Jeffrey York reports from Monrovia just a couple days ago that Mr. Taylor continues to hold sway over a sizable percentage of the population. Some say he could beat the current president, Nobel Peace Prize winner Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, in a fair election. If he's released from prison, people would parade all the way from the airport to the city, says one Liberian journalist. Alyx Vance?
Yes, Charles Taylor does have pockets of popularity in Liberia, definitely. It's a very different story from Sierra Leone. Well, I mean, there's tribal reasons, so ethnicity plays a role. There is a sense also that he has been victimized by the West. And there are, I have Liberian friends who still have a sympathetic hearing for him. It's true that if he re-entered Liberian politics, he would still be a key player there.
Now, ahead of the verdict, many in the Liberian capital were in favor of acquittal, but not always for the same reasons.
If I gave you other reasons, I just try to put everything in a nutshell. By saying Taylor is going to be a free man, he's going to walk out as a free man, because that trial in question was politically motivated. And I stand by my point.
that Taylor had a strong link to the Sierra Leone rebel. But to have been responsible or to have, directed them specifically to commit the kind of crime they committed, the mayhem they committed against their own people down there, it's a difficult thing.
So that Taylor had a hand, yes, but that he directed operations, that citizen of Monrovia has his doubts. Howard French, who covered the conflict for the New York Times, posted the following this Thursday on Twitter: "Wish I could have been in Freetown for Charles Taylor verdict. Justice is good, but his Liberian crimes are as great or greater." Jonathan Randall, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, the country simply dissolved after the assassination of the old Americo-Liberian elite. Sergeant Doe held forth for a while, and then there's just one warlord after another. And Taylor was an extremely effective man. I mean, he was much more impressive for good or for evil than some of his rivals. So it's perfectly true that the crimes were absolutely appalling. It was, children pressed into the various armies, ripping off the little infrastructure that existed, rape, theft. It was a Hobbesian world, and Taylor was, he won an election in 1997 for sure, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't responsible for a lot of the evil that happened. And once again, I must come back to my bedrock feeling that the West, for its own peculiar, nutty, quite irresponsible reasons, allowed all this to happen. I mean, I realize it's a neo-colonial view. I admit that, but it's when you think of what could have happened in those countries, all this could have been avoided. I mean, there was absolutely no reason.
And your thoughts about it was last year that the allegations were finally proven through documents that the CIA did in fact help Charles Taylor
get sprung from the prison in Boston. It was very mysterious. He was there because the Liberian government at the time accused him of stealing, embezzling $900,000.
This was in the late 1980s.
And all of a sudden, whammo, he was sprung. And as you say, the documents now established that it was the CIA that, for its own peculiar reasons, which did the deed, helped him out. I mean, I covered the third world, or at one point many years ago, it was called the underdeveloping world, and that's a very nasty, unfair, and pejorative way to look at it. But I mean, of all the horror shows of the third world, in a way, what happened, these two countries, these two neighboring countries, was in a class by itself, and it could have been stopped. And every time somebody tried to intervene, it was really only the British who sort of, Tony Blair, that sort of Gladstonian Christian fervor of his, who sent the British troops in, and that sort of stopped things for a while.
Let's ask Alpha Cisse about this. Alpha Cisse, the concept of aiding and abetting, did the West, in a way, help to create this whole situation?
I'm sorry, you have to go over that again, please. Can you, please?
I was saying, did the West help to create this situation when we now know that it was U.S. intelligence that helped Charles Taylor escape from his jailers in Massachusetts and make his way to start that rebel movement?
Well, I mean, the West, of course, could have played some role in this. I mean, I'm not quite sure about how much role the West played in the conflict in Sierra Leone, but speaking specifically about Charles Taylor's involvement in Liberia, or from where he controlled all of his activities, I mean, the role of the CIA or U.S. authorities came up during the proceedings in the Taylor trial. I mean, there was a time when Taylor himself was testifying and he was asked about the relationship that he had with U.S. authorities. He said there was a time when he had some cooperation with U.S. authorities, and I think there was some exchange of intelligence quite recently, when the Boston Globe reported that Taylor had been a spy for U.S. secret agents, he was very, very angry about it. He denied that. His defense lawyer wrote a letter asking the Boston Globe to retract that particular publication. And the Boston Globe did that, and they ended up saying that they had not done their investigation very well. So they played some role in all of this. How much of it, I can't say for sure. Taylor himself, when he testified about his escape from jail, he did not say in very clear terms that the CIA had taken him out of jail. He said, of course, he was woken up, asked to step out of jail, and there was a car waiting for him outside, and he believed that that could not have happened without the involvement of people in high places. So there could have been some role there.
All right, but of course, what ensued, of course, is not all the responsibility of one person or another. It's very tricky, all of this. The idea of who's responsible for what.
Absolutely, and you have different episodes, because by late 2002, the US was encouraging regime change, as it was in places like Iraq, and encouraging countries like Guinea to support the rebels that were in Liberia, the the Lourdes rebels, to push against Taylor and overstretch him. So you have a different strategy there from a previous period.
Charles Taylor's attorney, by the way, telling France 24 this Thursday that it's a double standard that applies, with allusion to Washington's support in the 1980s for the Central American anti-leftist insurgents.
What they've decided is that he was sending small amounts of arms over the border and thereby assisting the rebels. But, we shouldn't forget history. What did the Americans do in Nicaragua? What did they do in El Salvador and other places around the world? Exactly the same thing. They call it covert operations. I'm not suggesting that Taylor did, but the fact is, even if he did, historically, here we have the sovereign head of a sovereign country exercising his obligation to protect his country's interests. And as far as I'm concerned, if it's not illegal when the West do it, it shouldn't be illegal when he does.
All right. I suppose two wrongs don't make a right, though, Alyx Vance.
No, not at all. And there are other very indicative signs of how Liberia benefited from its pillaging of Sierra Leone. The spiking of diamond exports out of Liberia in the first part of the 2000s, for example, very telling. Where did those diamonds come from? Liberia produces very few diamonds in comparison from Sierra Leone. And there was a hotel just near the presidency called Hotel Boulevard. A lot of the trade was going through that location.
Alpha Cisse, what's next now for the international courts? We've seen a lot of comments today, people confusing. They don't realize necessarily that this court on Sierra Leone is not the same thing as the International Criminal Court, where the former Ivorian president, Laurent Gbagbo, is being tried. But there is this sort of general sense that these international courts are mostly just for sub-Saharan Africans and no one else.
These concerns have been expressed. Some of these concerns are, of course, legitimate. Of course, it is time for the International Court or the International Criminal Court or International Justice to look into other places outside the African continent. But whilst we say that, it is important to also note that we really cannot identify a case that is before the International Criminal Court and say this case is frivolous or this case is not supposed to be at the ICC. Maybe what we need to start doing is to move this debate from being perpetrator-focused to being victims-focused. Rather than looking at it as though the international justice system has been going after African perpetrators, let us probably say that the international justice system has been taking more steps to protect African victims. Maybe there are victims on other continents that are complaining that the international justice system has not provided protection for us. So probably let us look at it in the context of protection of victims. And these complaints that we've had people make, we haven't had the victims say so. The victims of the conflict in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Sudan, in DR Congo, in Uganda, we haven't had them complain that, the international justice system is just directed towards sub-Saharan Africa. We haven't had that. We've had the perpetrators complain, but this is more about the protection of victims. And I agree, of course, international justice needs to spread its reach beyond the African continent. But the victims of Africa deserve to be protected.
What do you think, Alyx Vance, the street credibility of these international courts at this point? Ivory Coast, for instance, we've seen Laurent Gbagbo's in the dock, but nobody from the other side that perpetrated massacres during the fighting last year there.
International justice needs to be even-handed, and I think this is where the new prosecutor coming in at the International Criminal Court will have to draw lessons from the past, including what happened in the Special Court for Sierra Leone, including the timing of indictments. It's a really important point. When the indictment was first opened in 2003, there were peace talks in Ghana, and Charles Taylor was about to agree to leave Liberia. What resulted, though, was that he had to flee back to Liberia, and it gave a green light for rebel attacks on the city. They're called World Wars I, II, and III in Monrovia. Lots of civilians died. It's the timing. It's the same with the timing of the indictment by the ICC of the president of Sudan, President el-Bashir. Clearly, there's probably a good case for it, but it delayed various other processes that were taking place. So again, actually, prosecutors need to consider the political context also, and not just launch ahead as soon as they think they've got a case. The timing is everything.
Do they consider it not enough or too much, Jonathan Randall, when you look, for instance, at Lebanon, which is a tinderbox and where one indictment handed up can create violence?
Yeah.
Well, you asked me a very delicate question because I've spent many, many years in Lebanon. I've had several friends of mine killed in follow-up killings to the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in 2005. It's a terrible mess because it's become so politicized that it's almost impossible to think that the case will ever be brought, ever take place, the trial will ever take place. It is very difficult to imagine what the punishment would be.
So right now, for now in Lebanon, it's at a standstill.
It's at a standstill, but on the other hand, look, let's be frank. I mean, the Prime Minister, the very powerful man, the former Prime Minister was blown up in a very drastic way. I'm being polite. It would have been very difficult not to do something. And the problem is maybe one has to move very quickly. Mr. Vance talks about this, timing. Timing is everything. I think in the Lebanese case, it would have been much better to move very quickly before the geopolitics of the region changed.
Right, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
There isn't. I mean, in Kenya, for example, the timing, I think, was right on the indictments, whereas I think the timings on Sudan and Liberia actually were wrong if the results are correct.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Alyx Vance, I want to thank you. I want to thank Jonathan Randall. I also want to thank Alpha Cisse for joining us from the International Court in The Hague. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Coming up next, It's Business, hosted by Catherine Nicholson.
Le premier tour représente une sanction du quinquennat qui s'achève.
J'y consacrerai toute l'énergie dont je suis capable.
Le 6 mai, je veux une victoire, une belle victoire.
Les Français ont le droit à la vérité et à la clarté. Tout commence!
Follow all the events as they happen on France 24.